Welcome to today's lecture on Henry VIII. Today, we will examine the question of to what extent was there a revolution in government between 1532 and 1540. These dates specifically cover the years in which Thomas Cromwell was Henry's chief minister. We will first examine the argument posed by eminent Tudor historian Geoffrey Elton that during the 1530s England underwent a revolution in government. We will then study the domestic reforms introduced by Thomas Cromwell that support Elton's argument. Secondly, we will examine the religious policies that also feed into this argument, especially in terms of the growth of the role of Parliament. Finally, we will examine the counter-argument that Henrician England remained a personal monarchy, and that very little changed in the management of government. Let's firstly examine Geoffrey Elton's argument that there was a revolution in government. The term revolution suggests a sudden and radical change in the way that the government was run. In Elton's most famous works, The Tudor Revolution in Government, he makes several bold claims. These are best encapsulated in this key quote: "One of the most remarkable English statesmen of the 16th century, and one of the most remarkable of the country's history. He instigated and in part accomplished a major and enduring transformation in virtually every aspect of public life." Let's pick this quote apart. Firstly, Elton is describing Thomas Cromwell as the most remarkable English statesman of the 16th century. In other words, his contribution to government was greater than that of Thomas Wolsey before him and William Cecil, who acted as Elizabeth's chief minister for over 30 years. If this was not already a bold claim, he goes further to say that Cromwell was one of the most remarkable statesmen of the country's history. This would put Cromwell in the same league as his more notorious distant relative Oliver Cromwell, but also modern prime ministers like Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George. Therefore, it cannot be emphasized just how important Cromwell's contribution was to the development of English government, according to Elton. Elton's second claim was that Cromwell instigated, or started, and in part accomplished, an enduring transformation in government. Elton recognizes that Cromwell's premature death in 1540 meant that he was unable to fully accomplish his aims, but he nonetheless believes that Cromwell left behind a legacy because the transformation endured beyond the reign of Henry VIII. Finally, Elton claims that Cromwell's revolution of government encompassed every aspect of public life. The phrase public life in this context means all aspects of government, including both central and regional government. This means that the changes Cromwell made were wide-ranging and would have affected not only the regions of England, but also Wales and Ireland. By making this bold claim for a revolution in government, Elton was arguing that there was a shift from the old medieval system centered on a personal monarchy to a modern system whereby power was spread more evenly between king, government ministers and parliament. It is this theory that we will be testing for the remainder of the lecture. Let's now examine the evidence from Cromwell's domestic policies. When I refer to domestic policy, I mean any changes made to finance, parliament, or aspects of government. Whilst religious policy is technically part of domestic policy, for the second half of the Tudor period it is best to consider it separately. Cromwell was appointed as Lord Chancellor following the resignation of Thomas More in 1532. This was at the height of the break with Rome, and so his focus remained largely on religious policy until 1536, when all the key legislation had been passed. This means that the domestic reforms Cromwell made took place during a narrow period of time, between 1536 and 1540. One of the most important changes that Cromwell made was the establishment of the Privy Council. We do not have a definitive date for when this was established, but by 1540 Cromwell had appointed a royal clerk to formally take minutes at Privy Council meetings. Before 1536, the king had the Royal Council. This was technically made up of every lord and prelate, or high-ranking clergyman, in the realm, and so had over 200 members. Due to the unwieldy size, it met seldom, and it was often dominated by one or two personalities, most recently by Thomas Wolsey. Cromwell changed this so that the king had a privy council of approximately 20 appointed members. This was a good size to allow for debate, discussion, and a good range of both opinions and expertise. As the Privy Council evolved, each councillor gained specific roles, such as Lord Treasurer and Secretary of State. This is a precursor to the modern-day cabinet of the government today, which contains ministers for specific government departments, like education, health, work and pensions, and defence. Elton's argument was that England's government moved from being a personal monarchy to being a modern state. This requires the introduction of more bureaucracy. In other words, it is a shift away from the king appointing members of the nobility into key positions toward the appointment of officials that come from a professional background, for example, the clerk to the Privy Council. Cromwell established a team of professionals around him. Many of these were united due to their Protestant faith, but they came from the gentry and merchant classes rather than the nobility. The other feature of a more bureaucratic state is the introduction of more government departments, especially in terms of finance. Henry VII had moved the royal treasury from the exchequer to the royal chambers so that he could more closely monitor finances. This worked well for Henry VII, but Henry VIII did not pay close attention to finance, and so by 1536 the treasury was not well managed. Furthermore, the break with Rome and dissolution of the monasteries saw a greater influx of finance into the royal treasury. Therefore, Cromwell established new financial departments. The most important of these was the Court of Augmentation, which managed the additional revenue that now came in from the closure of the monasteries. Cromwell also looked to bring Wales under English law, which he accomplished with the Act of Union in 1536. Before this, Wales had been a separate principality with its own laws, language and customs. The Act of Union made it formally part of the nation, and placed the Welsh counties under English law. The Welsh counties were then divided into regions overseen by a Justice of the Peace, and each region was also given representation in Parliament. This really strengthened the ties between the Welsh government and Westminster. Having said this, Wales remained distinctly separate in other ways. For example, it still retained its own language. Even though the English kings had been the overlords of Ireland, in reality, they had limited control beyond the Pale of Dublin. The position of Lord Deputy, the de facto ruler, was dominated by the Fitzgerald family, who were the Earls of Kildare. In the 1530s, the Earl of Kildare staged a rebellion against the Crown, where he appealed to Charles V for support in upholding Ireland as a Catholic nation. After this rebellion was defeated, Cromwell put in a number of measures in order to place Ireland more firmly under English control. The first of these was the policy of surrender and regrant. This was when the Irish earls had to voluntarily surrender their estates to the Crown, swear loyalty to Henry as not only their overlord, but as their king, and then have the lands regranted. This policy was largely successful. Furthermore, a bill was put forward to the Irish Parliament to turn Ireland into a kingdom. This act was not passed until after Cromwell's death. Ireland formally became a kingdom in 1542. This both centralised government, creating firmer links between Westminster and the Irish Parliament in Dublin, and bolstered Henry's sovereignty. Let's now examine the way in which the break with Rome and Henrician Reformation relates to Elton's revolution in government theory. The most important example is the introduction of the concept of king in Parliament. This relates to the numerous legislation that was passed during the 1530s to enable the break with Rome. To give a sense of perspective, between the start of Henry's reign in 1509 and 1531, there had been roughly 200 acts passed through Parliament, mostly focused on regional issues. In contrast, between 1532 and 1540, over 300 acts were passed, including groundbreaking legislation like the Act of Supremacy. For Elton and many other historians, this decade signaled a key turning point in the role of Parliament in government. It was no longer simply a tax-granting body that also dealt with petitions about regional issues. Now it dealt with the main laws and policies for the governance of the country. Many historians have seen the increased role of Parliament following the break with Rome as a long-term cause of the English Civil War, which would break out just over a century later, in the 1640s. This is because Parliament was now being given a much more central role in policymaking, and so over time MPs became more vocal in their demands toward the Crown. We see this by the end of the Elizabethan period, when Parliament attempted to criticize Elizabeth's refusal to marry or name a successor. However, she is always able to affirm her royal prerogative over what she considered to be matters of both personal significance and national security. However, by the Stuart era, the voices in Parliament became ever more vocal and assertive. Furthermore, the break with Rome meant that the English Church now fell firmly under the control of the state. This had huge implications, because the government was now responsible for the establishment of church doctrine and practices, including what constituted as both treason and heresy. This bolstered Henry's sovereignty, and also set England apart from its European counterparts, as the only nation to have fully and officially converted to the Protestant faith. Another significant change that took place was a shift in land ownership. Prior to the break with Rome, the Catholic Church owned up to 1/3 of the land in England, most of which was vast farmland surrounding rural monasteries. The transfer of this land to the English crown had both economic and political implications. This is because Henry decided to sell off much of the church lands at a below market value price. Those who bought the land were effectively buying into the new regime, and so became a new ruling class of Protestants in the localities. This certainly helped to achieve nationwide support for the English Reformation, though support for Catholicism remained strong among the traditional nobility, especially in the north. In the long term, it would be these new landed gentry and lesser noblemen that would become prominent figures in local government and parliament, especially after financial persecution against the Catholics began in the later Tudor period. Therefore, this transfer of land ownership changed the political nation and political landscape of England forever. Let's now examine the counter-argument to Elton's revolution in government argument. The argument can be undermined from two directions. Firstly, it could be argued that there was more continuity than change in the style of government, especially in terms of the role of the monarch. Secondly, historians have argued that rather than there being a decade of revolutionary change that happened quickly, there was rather a century of evolutionary change, which accumulated in the executed of an anointed king in 1649, with the execution of Charles I and the failed establishment of a republic. Elton's pupil and leading Tudor historian, David Starkey, argues strongly for the continued existence of personal monarchy during the reign of Henry VIII. He believes that any new systems that were established were done so as a result of Henry and his actions. The break with Rome is evidence of this, since it was motivated from start to finish by Henry's desire to achieve an annulment and male heir. This certainly supports Starkey's argument. There is also evidence of factionalism in the final decade of Elizabeth's reign, which further suggests there was no revolutionary change in the way the royal court was governed. Furthermore, Starkey argues that Henry's reign was a period of factionalism whereby noble families fought in the royal court for power and influence. Cromwell himself was entangled in this during the fall of Anne Boleyn in 1536. He would then fall victim to the largest court faction, the Conservative faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk in 1540, resulting in his execution. During the final decade of Henry's reign, factionalism was rife, resulting in a power struggle over control of Edward as a boy king. John Guy does not fully reject Elton's argument, since he acknowledges the 1530s as an important decade of the 16th century. However, he does not believe Cromwell was a revolutionary. He argues that he was a pragmatist, arriving at solutions to the problems brought about by the break with Rome. For example, the Court of Augmentation came out of necessity. There was a sudden influx of cash from the dissolution of the monasteries, and this was too much for the chamber system to handle, and so a new court was created. The Court of Augmentation would fall into disuse once it had served its initial purpose. Alternatively, Guy argued that there was an evolution to a more modern style of government, and that whilst this began in the 1530s, the change took place over a long period of time. This can be evidenced in Elizabeth's reign, through the consistent use of the Privy Council, with its close ties to Parliament, to provide consistent and stable government for the majority of the reign. There are a few counter-arguments of my own to add. Rather than looking forward to the Elizabethan or Stuart age, let's look back to the changes made under Henry VII. At the start of his reign, he used Parliament to pass a number of highly significant acts, such as the Act of Attainder to punish the Yorkist nobility, and the Act of Resumption to recover Crown lands that had been lost during the War of the Roses. This bolstered his sovereignty despite his very dubious claim to the throne, in a not dissimilar way, as the acts for the break with Rome were used to justify Henry's annulment and marriage to Anne Boleyn. Furthermore, Parliament remained subservient to both Henrys, despite the controversial nature of the laws being passed, showing that during the early Tudor age Parliament was still not playing an active role in government. Secondly, I do not believe that the legislation passed to tighten up the links between central and regional government were revolutionary. Henry VII had already increased the role of justices of peace, and Cromwell simply extended their jurisdiction into Wales. The Pilgrimage of Grace proved that the North remained an unruly and semi-independent region, despite the loss of liberties for cities like Durham. It wouldn't be until after extensive colonization by Protestant settlers and the brutal reconquest of Oliver Cromwell that Ireland was forcefully placed under English control. And even then, the nation would never remain at peace. The most notable example, though, is the impact of the changes in Ireland. Henry VII had already established Poynings law in Ireland, but this had a minimal impact. Cromwell's policy of surrender and redress would have a similarly minimal impact. English authority remained slim beyond the Pale of Dublin, and there would be continued attempts to establish an Irish confederacy over the next century, most notably the 9 Years' War of the 1590s and the Irish Rebellion of the 1640s. Let's now return to our overarching question of to what extent was there a revolution in government between 1532 and 1540. Firstly, it is important to know Geoffrey Elton's argument that during the 1530s, England transformed from a medieval system of personal monarchy to a modern bureaucratic state. This change was mostly accomplished by 1540 and would have a long-lasting impact on not only English but British politics. The most significant evidence to support this argument comes from the domestic reforms of Chief Minister Thomas Cromwell. These reforms placed the regions of England under more central power, and also established new courts and ministerial positions to make government most efficient. From the examples we have studied, the creation of the Privy Council as an official advisory body is perhaps the most important. However, many historians believe that Elton has overstated the changes of the 1530s. David Starkey completely rejects the notion that there was a revolution in government, arguing that English government remained a personal monarchy, whilst Guy believes that crucial changes did happen during this time, but they were the beginning of a slower evolution. Regardless of which argument you support, there is plenty of evidence to support both sides and provide balance. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture to learn about the final decade of Henry VIII's reign. Secondly, it is important to remember that these changes all took place against the backdrop of huge religious changes. In this sense, there truly was a revolution in England, whereby the Church was no longer under the control of the papacy in Rome, and was now under the control of the English state. This is further reinforced by the increased use of Parliament to pass groundbreaking acts.